The tarnished brass bell of Providence Hills Chapel rang hollow as Emmeline Harper struggled up the weathered steps, her twisted right foot dragging behind her like an unwanted shadow. The anticipation in the eyes of the wedding guests turned to whispers, then to cruel laughter as the groom's face contorted from practiced smile to disgusted sneer at the sight of his bride's deformity. No one expected the notorious bounty hunter with a face carved by violence to rise from the back pew and claim what another man had so callously discarded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The white lace of Emmeline's borrowed wedding dress caught on a splintered floorboard as she made her way down the aisle of Providence Hill's only chapel. She fought to maintain her balance, gripping her small bouquet of wildflowers so tightly that their stems leaked green onto her gloves. Emmeline had spent hours practicing this walk, determined that on this one day, her wedding day, her misshapen foot would not define her. 3 years had passed since the mining accident that crushed her right foot, leaving it permanently twisted despite the best efforts of the company doctor. 3 years of pitying glances and hushed comments when she passed on the street. 3 years of correspondence with Preston Caldwell, heir to the Caldwell Mining Company, who had described himself as a forward-thinking businessman seeking an educated companion in his advertisement for a mail-order bride. The morning sunlight streamed through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the modest gathering. Most were Preston's business associates and their curious wives, dressed in finery that made Emmeline's second-hand wedding dress seem like little more than a farmhand's Sunday best. "She's here," someone whispered from the third row, the words carrying clearly through the silent chapel. "The mail-order bride," another voice answered, with no attempt to hide the judgment in her tone. Preston Caldwell stood at the altar, his tailored suit immaculate, his golden hair perfectly combed. As his eyes traveled from Emmeline's face to her halting gait, his polished smile froze, then collapsed entirely. The pocket watch chain across his vest gleamed as his chest expanded with indignation. "What is this deception?" he hissed loud enough for the front row to hear. "You never mentioned you were a cripple." The last word fell from his lips like acid, burning through Emmeline's carefully constructed hopes. Emmeline stopped halfway down the aisle, the chapel suddenly spinning around her. "I wrote about the accident," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. "You wrote of a minor injury." Preston stepped backward away from her, as if her condition might be contagious. "This is unacceptable." Someone snickered in the back pew. Then another. Soon, laughter rippled through the small gathering, mostly Preston's business associates and their curious wives. Emmeline felt heat rising in her cheeks as 24 pairs of eyes fixed on her twisted foot, now seeming to throb beneath their collective gaze. "The ceremony is cancelled," Preston announced, straightening his waistcoat with practiced dignity. "I cannot be expected to marry damaged goods." He spoke as if discussing a shipment of bruised fruit rather than a woman standing before him, heart breaking in real time. The chapel emptied quickly, ladies whispering behind lace handkerchiefs, men clapping Preston on the shoulder in masculine solidarity. No one met Emmeline's eyes as they filed past. Soon only she remained, seated on the front pew where the elderly pastor had guided her with pitying hands. "I'll return shortly, my child," he'd promised. But hours passed, and the afternoon light slanted long through the windows. She remained, there unable to face the town that had just witnessed her humiliation. With nowhere to go and no money to leave, her uncle's letter had been clear. There was no room for her return to Silver Creek. The stage fare she'd spent to reach Providence Hill had emptied her meager savings. When the chapel door finally creaked open, Emmeline didn't turn, probably the pastor coming to tell her she needed to leave before evening service. Instead, heavy bootsteps echoed through the empty chapel, deliberate and slow. She felt a presence. Stopped beside her pew, a shadow falling across her lap. Still waiting on that wedding? The voice was deep and rough, like stones tumbling down a mountainside. Emmeline looked up, and her breath caught. A tall man stood before her, his face a landscape of contradiction. A jagged scar ran from his left hairline down to his jaw, cutting through his eyebrow and pulling at the corner of his mouth. His right eye was the clear blue of a winter sky, while his left was darker, almost indigo, the mark of heterochromia. His black hair was cut short on the sides, but longer on top, as if he'd grown tired of shearing halfway through. A neatly trimmed beard framed his severe features, not quite hiding the scar, but somehow making it part of a deliberate whole. She recognized him from whispered stories. Thorne Blackwell, the bounty hunter who had appeared in Providence Hill 3 days ago. The man they said had tracked killers across 4 territories. The man they said had once been a lawman before something broke inside him. "No," she answered finally, finding her voice. "There won't be a wedding." Thorne's mismatched eyes studied her for a long moment, seeing more than Emmeline was comfortable with. Without another word, he extended a gloved hand toward her. The leather was worn but well cared for, like everything about him. His clothes simple but clean, his stance controlled despite the obvious weight of the gun holstered at his hip. Confusion clouded her thoughts. "Sir?" The chapel doors banged open. Again as Preston Caldwell and several townsmen strode in. They froze at the sight of Thorne. "Blackwell," Preston sputtered, color draining from his face. "You dare show your face here?" Thorne didn't turn, his hand still extended to Emmeline. "She doesn't belong here," he said, his voice carrying through. "The chapel like distant thunder. Take her then," Preston laughed, regaining his composure with visible effort. "The cripple and the killer, a perfect match." The men behind him chuckled, finding courage in numbers. Thorne finally turned, his posture shifting subtly. Something in his stance made the men step back, hands drifting toward hidden weapons. "She wasn't made for you," he said softly, dangerously. "None of you deserve her." Heart pounding, Emmeline placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. As they walked down the aisle together, past the stunned faces of the townspeople, Emmeline felt the weight of stares. But for the first time since the accident, not all the eyes were on her twisted foot. Outside the chapel, the afternoon sun hung low over Providence Hill's dusty main street. Emmeline blinked in the harsh light, suddenly uncertain of the choice she'd made. Following a scarred bounty hunter seemed scarcely better than being abandoned at the altar. "Why?" she asked, pulling her hand from his grasp. "Why would you help me?" Thorne surveyed the town, his mismatched eyes narrowing at the faces, watching from storefronts and saloon windows. Women pulled children indoors. Men stepped onto porches, hands resting casually near holstered weapons. "I've got my reasons," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "That's not an answer. A hint of something. Amusement, perhaps, flickered across his scarred features. "You want answers, Miss Harper, or you want to get out of this town before nightfall?" Her last name on his lips startled her. She hadn't introduced herself. Before she could ask how he knew her, a voice called out from behind them. "Blackwell, you've got some nerve showing your face in this town." Sheriff Ellis approached, hand hovering near his holster. The lawman was in his 40s, his moustache neatly trimmed, but his stance suggested he was no stranger to violence. 2 deputies flanked him, younger men with something to prove. "Just passing through," Thorne replied, evenly. "With Caldwell's bride?" The sheriff's gaze shifted to Emmeline. "Miss, are you going with this man willingly?" An unexpected question. Was she? Emmeline glanced between the sheriff and the chapel where Preston now stood on the steps, watching with poorly disguised relief. She straightened her spine. "Yes," she said firmly. "Mr. Caldwell rejected our arrangement. I'm free to leave with whomever I choose." The sheriff frowned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "You know who this man is? What he does?" "I know the stories," she replied, though in truth she knew only fragments. Whispers of a territorial marshal turned bounty hunter, rumors of men found dead rather than brought to justice. Not stories, facts. Sheriff Ellis stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This man has killed 12 men in the last 3 years, always claims self-defense or necessity, and technically he has the right papers, but we all know what he is." Thorne remained perfectly still, his face impassive. Something about his calm made Emmeline doubt the sheriff's certainty. "She's made her choice," Thorne said finally. "We'll be gone within the hour." The sheriff's hand tightened on his gun belt. "Caldwell's father sits on the town council. He sees you leaving with her. There'll be trouble. Then we'd best not linger." They walked in tense silence to the livery stable at the edge of town. Emmeline struggled to keep pace with Thorne's long strides. Her foot ached from standing so long in the chapel, but she refused to complain. The stable boy's eyes widened at the sight of Thorne. Without a word, the boy scurried to the back, returning moments later with an older man, the livery owner. "Blackwell." The man nodded cautiously. "Your horse is ready, and the mare you asked about this morning." Emmeline shot Thorne a questioning look. He'd already arranged for a horse for her, hours before their meeting in the chapel. While Thorne paid the stable owner, Emmeline wondered about her meager possessions at the boarding house. Everything she owned was in a single trunk: clothes, her father's pocket watch, her mother's Bible with pressed flowers between its pages. As if reading her thoughts, Thorne turned to her. "Where are your things?" Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, 2nd floor, east room. He considered this, then handed the stable owner more coins. "Need a pack horse too." The livery owner looked at Emmeline's foot, then back to Thorne with a question. "In his eyes, she'll manage," Thorne said firmly. An hour later they rode out of Providence Hill. Emmeline on a gentle dappled mare, Thorne on a powerful black stallion that seemed as forbidding as its master. Behind them, a pack-horse carried Emmeline's trunk, retrieved by the livery owner's son for an extra $1. "Where are we going?" Emmeline asked as the town disappeared behind them, the buildings growing smaller against the vast landscape of rolling foothills and distant mountains. "Somewhere safe," was all he said, guiding them toward the dense forest that bordered the northern valley. As they rode, Emmeline caught him glancing at her occasionally, assessing her riding. She sat straight in the saddle, determined not to show weakness despite the growing pain in her right foot. Whatever his reasons for helping her, she wouldn't be a burden. Only when they entered the shadow of the pines did she realize that, for better or worse, she had trusted her fate to a man whose very name made people tremble. The forest closed around them like a sanctuary, pine branches filtering the late afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns across the narrow trail. The air smelled of resin and earth, so different from the coal dust and horse manure of Providence Hill. Emmeline breathed deeply, letting the scent wash away the memory of laughter echoing through the chapel. "How much farther?" she asked, breaking an hour's silence. Her twisted foot throbbed with each step of the mare, but she'd endured worse pain. "Another hour," Thorne replied without turning. His black stallion picked its way confidently through the undergrowth, clearly familiar with the path. As they rode deeper into the forest, Emmeline studied her unlikely savior. In the shifting forest light, his scarred profile seemed less monstrous, merely marked by experience. His movements in the saddle were fluid, economical. Whatever violence lay in his past, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who asked nothing from the world. The sun was setting when they finally emerged into a small clearing. A cabin stood in its center, rustic but solid, with a covered porch and chimney of stacked river stones. A stream gurgled nearby, and a small corral adjoined a lean-to stable. It was not what she had expected from a notorious bounty hunter. "Your home?" she asked, surprised by the domesticity of the scene. Thorn nodded, dismounting with easy grace. He approached her horse, looking up at her with his mismatched eyes. "Need help?" Pride warred with practicality. After hours in the saddle, her twisted foot had stiffened to near uselessness. "Yes," she admitted. His hands were strong and careful as they spanned her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could see the intricate pattern of his scar, the way his beard was starting to show threads of silver despite his relatively young age, the flecks of gold in his blue eye. He stepped back abruptly. "I'll tend the horses. Make yourself comfortable." Inside, the cabin surprised her again. It was spare but clean, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron cook stove, and shelves stocked with provisions. A curtain partitioned off what she assumed was a sleeping area. Books, actual books, lined a rough-hewn shelf, not the trappings of a killer or a drifter, but of a man who had built a life here. A lawman's badge hung beside the door, tarnished with age or deliberate neglect. Emmeline sank onto a chair, massaging her aching foot through her boot. When Thorn returned, he carried her trunk, setting it beside the door before busying himself with lighting a fire. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, determined to get an answer. The kindling caught, flames casting his scarred face in dramatic shadow. "Caldwell is a snake," he said simply. "Saw what he did to you. Wasn't right. There's more to it than that." Thorn straightened, looking at her directly. "Yes. Will you tell me?" "When you need to know." He moved to the stove, striking another match. "Hungry?" The sudden change of subject frustrated her, but the mention of food reminded Emmeline she hadn't eaten since morning. "Yes." As Thorn prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, Emmeline observed him. His movements were precise, practiced. This was clearly a routine for him. He handled the knife with the same confidence he'd shown with his horse, with no wasted motion. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes." "For how long?" 2 years. He stirred the beans. "Since I left the marshal's service." "The sheriff said he killed people." His hand paused over the pot, then resumed stirring. "He would." "Did you?" Thorn turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Harper, we've got an arrangement to figure out. You need a place to stay until you decide where to go next. I can provide that. What I can't provide is answers to questions that don't concern your immediate future. If I'm staying under your roof, your past very much concerns me," she countered. Ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough, but not tonight." He placed a steaming plate before her. "Tonight you eat and rest. Tomorrow's soon enough for difficult conversations." They ate in silence. The food was plain but satisfying, and Emmeline realized how famished she truly was. After clearing their plates, Thorn disappeared behind the curtain, returning with a pillow and blankets. "You'll take the bed," he said, arranging the blankets on a bearskin rug near the fire. "I'll sleep here." Emmeline hesitated. "I can't take your bed." "You can and will." His tone brooked no argument. "Your foot needs proper rest." Too exhausted to protest further, Emmeline retreated behind the curtain. The bed was a simple frame with a straw-filled mattress, but after her ordeal, it felt luxurious. As she changed into her nightgown, she heard Thorn moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire, checking doors and windows. "Mr. Blackwell," she called softly. The movements paused. "Yes?" "Thank you." The words felt insufficient but necessary. A long silence followed. "Sleep well, Miss Harper," he finally replied, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. As Emmeline drifted towards sleep, she realized something strange. For the first time since the accident that mangled her foot and left her dependent on the charity of distant relatives, she felt safe. The bounty hunter with the scarred face and the reputation for violence had shown her more kindness in a few hours than she had known in 3 years of pity. The irony was not lost on her as she surrendered to exhaustion, wondering what tomorrow would bring in this unexpected sanctuary. Dawn filtered through the cabin's single window, rousing Emmeline from the deepest sleep she'd known in months. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. This wasn't Mrs. Wilson's boarding house in Providence Hill. Then yesterday's events crashed back. The humiliation at the chapel, the scarred bounty hunter, the forest cabin. She dressed quickly in her simplest skirt and blouse, smoothing the wrinkles as best she could. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drew her from behind the curtain. Thorne stood at the cook stove, his back to her, a pot of something fragrant sizzling on the surface. The blankets where he'd slept were already folded neatly by the fireplace. His gun belt hung on a peg near the door, within easy reach, she noticed. "How long have you been up?" she asked, accepting the steaming mug he offered without turning. "Since first light, always am." He moved a cast-iron skillet from the heat. "Breakfast's ready. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going." They ate in companionable silence, bacon, eggs, and johnny cakes with honey. Emmeline's mind churned with questions, but she sensed pushing too hard would only make Thorne withdraw. Instead, she observed. The cabin told stories his words did not. A marshal's badge hung beside a hand-drawn map of the territory marked with crosses in red ink. A rifle rack held 3 different long guns, each meticulously cleaned. Most surprising was a small shelf holding medical supplies, bandages, tinctures, even surgical tools, arranged with surprising precision for a man living alone in the wilderness. After breakfast, he surprised her. "Need to check my trap lines. You'll be all right here for a few hours?" "Of course," she hesitated. "May I look at your books?" Something like pleasure flickered in his mismatched eyes. "Help yourself. There's drawing paper in the trunk beneath the window if you're inclined." After he left, Emmeline explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bookshelf revealed unexpected treasures, volumes on regional lore, several dog-eared novels, a medical text similar to one she'd seen in the company doctor's office after her accident. Most surprising was a well-worn copy of Tennyson's poems, the pages dog-eared and marked. The cabin itself told a story of careful self-sufficiency. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. Preserved meats and vegetables lined shelves in the small root cellar accessible through a trap door. Everything had its place, nothing wasted or frivolous. This was not the home of a reckless killer, but of a man who valued order and preparation. By midday, restlessness drove her outside. The clearing around the cabin was well maintained, with a small vegetable garden to one side. She spotted a patch of wild strawberries and knelt awkwardly to pick them, ignoring the protests from her twisted foot. "Your father was Judge Harper from Silver Creek," Emmeline started, nearly toppling. Thorne stood at the forest's edge, a brace of rabbits over his shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach. "Yes," she confirmed, surprised. "How did you know?" "Served. In his court, before I took the marshal's badge." Thorne approached, setting down his catch. He was a fair man, one of the few who couldn't be bought. The pieces connected suddenly. "You were that marshal, the one who testified against the mining companies?" Thorne nodded once. 5 years ago. "My father spoke of you, said you were the only lawman brave enough to stand against Blackwater mining." Emmeline straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her foot. "He never mentioned your name." "Protecting me, most likely." Thorne knelt to clean the rabbits, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. After the trial, there were threats. Emmeline moved closer, fascinated by this connection to her father. The mines were found negligent in 17 deaths, fined a pittance. Money speaks louder than justice in these parts. There was no bitterness in his voice, merely resignation. Your father was one of the good ones. Emmeline fought the familiar wave of grief. He died believing the law could protect common folk from powerful men. A noble delusion. Thorne looked up from his work, studying her face. The mining accident that took your foot. Same company, wasn't it? She stiffened. Yes. Blackwater's north shaft collapsed 3 years ago. 32 men died. I was bringing my father's lunch that day. You were lucky to survive at all. Lucky! The word hung bitter in her mouth. That's what everyone said. How fortunate you only lost the use of your foot, Miss Harper. As if half a life was better than none, Thorne was silent for a long moment, his hands still on the rabbits. Half a life, he finally echoed. Is that what you think you have? Isn't it? No husband, no prospects, no future beyond charity and pity. The words spilled out before she could stop them, raw and honest, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. Thorne's mismatched eyes held hers steadily. If that's what you believe, why did you leave that chapel with me? The question stunned her. Why had she? She'd had no reason to trust this scarred stranger with the dangerous reputation. I don't know, she admitted. Perhaps any escape seemed better than none. Thorne nodded, as if she'd confirmed something important. Survival. Instinct good, you'll need it. What does that mean? Instead of answering, he resumed cleaning the rabbits. These will make a decent stew. Can you cook? The abrupt change of subject was becoming a pattern. Yes, my mother taught me before she died. The herbs by the door are fresh. Use what you like. Throughout the afternoon, they worked separately but in awareness of each other. Emmeline preparing vegetables for the stew, Thorne repairing a broken fence post in the corral. They moved around each other like cautious dancers, maintaining distance but acknowledging presence. As evening approached, Emmeline was stirring the bubbling stew when rapid hoofbeats approached the clearing. Thorne appeared instantly at her. Side, rifle in hand. Inside, he ordered, his voice low. Stay away from the windows. Through a small gap in the curtains, Emmeline watched a young man ride into the clearing. He wore a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, but he couldn't have been more than 20. His face was vaguely familiar. That's Caldwell's younger brother, Thorne muttered, positioning himself by the window. Samuel. How do you know? Been watching Providence Hill for a week. His jaw tightened. Stay here. He stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered but visible. Deputy Caldwell. The young man's face contorted with dislike. Blackwell. Sheriff said you took Miss Harper. Didn't take anyone. She came willingly. Samuel's eyes flickered to the window where Emmeline stood partially hidden. My brother says different. Says you interfered with a private matter. Abandoning a woman at the altar isn't private. It's cowardice. The deputy's face flushed. The Harper woman misrepresented herself. Preston had every right to humiliate her in front of the whole town. Thorne's voice remained even, but Emmeline could see tension in his shoulders. What do you want, deputy? Samuel straightened in his saddle. Just delivering a message. Preston wants his money back. Says she took $50 from him as a marriage settlement. She took nothing. To Preston, she is nothing. Samuel gathered his reins. He'll be filing a complaint with the territorial authorities, says you've got until tomorrow to return the money, or he'll press charges for theft. On what grounds? Does it matter? My father owns half the county judges. The young man spat on the ground. Be smart, Blackwell. You're already wanted in 2 territories. How many more enemies can you afford? As the deputy rode away, Emmeline saw something she hadn't expected in Thorne's posture. Not fear or anger, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. Whatever brought him to Providence Hill before their meeting at the chapel, it was more complex than chance. It haunted him in ways she was only beginning to glimpse. Night fell like a curtain over the forest. Dinner passed quietly. the weight of Deputy Caldwell's visit hanging between them. Emmeline sensed Thorne withdrawing further into himself with each passing hour, his replies becoming more clipped, his gaze distant. "You should leave tomorrow," he finally said as he stoked the fire for the evening. "I can take you to the stage stop at River Junction, 30 miles east." Because of what the deputy said, Thorne's hand tightened on the poker. "Caldwell isn't a man to cross. If he's offering a reward for your return like stolen property." Emmeline set down the shirt she'd been mending, one of Thorne's, torn at the sleeve. "I am not his to reclaim. To men like him, everything has a price." Thorne straightened, firelight dancing across his scarred features. "Everyone can be bought or sold." What did I supposedly steal from him? A muscle twitched in Thorne's jaw. "Nothing that matters." Then why? Why this charade of moral outrage over $50 he willingly gave me? It's not about money. He turned to face her fully. It's about pride. No one refuses Preston Caldwell. No one leaves him. And no one associated with me gets to live peacefully. The bitterness in his voice revealed more than all his silences. Later, as Emmeline lay in the bed behind the curtain, she heard Thorne moving restlessly on his makeshift bed by the fire. Sleep eluded her as well, her mind churning with questions. What connected Thorne to the Caldwells? Why had he been watching Providence Hill before her arrival? A low moan from beyond the curtain jolted her fully awake, then another, followed by mumbled words. Throwing back the covers, she limped to the partition and peered around it. Thorne thrashed in his blankets, his face contorted. "Get back!" He muttered. "Fire in the shaft! Everyone out!" His voice rose to a shout. "Harper, get your daughter clear! The supports won't hold!" Without thinking, Emmeline knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Thorne, wake up! It's just a nightmare!" Bolted upright, his hand closing like a vice around her wrist. For a terrifying moment his eyes were wild, unseeing. Then recognition dawned, and he released her instantly. Emmeline. He rarely used her first name. It sounded different in his rough voice, almost reverent. "You were dreaming." She rubbed her wrist, knowing there would be bruises tomorrow. "You called out my father's name." Shame crossed his face. "Did I hurt you?" "No." The lie came easily. "You were dreaming about the mine collapse." Thorne closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they held such raw pain that Emmeline's breath caught. "I was there," he said softly. "The day of the collapse, investigating reports of unsafe conditions." The story untangled itself in her mind. "You were the marshal who tried to evacuate the mine." He nodded once. "Too late. The supports were already failing when I arrived. Your father was inspecting working conditions, a surprise visit. He brought you along to see the operation. I remember the inspection. Not you. I was in plain clothes. Company management didn't know I was a marshal." His gaze grew distant. "Your father figured it out, though, sharp man. We were below ground when the first timbers cracked. Understanding dawned. You knew who I was from the beginning. In Providence Hill, yes. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have trusted me if I had?" He looked away. "A stranger claiming a connection to the worst day of your life." The memory of that day surfaced. The groaning timbers, the sudden darkness, the screams of trapped men. Her father pushing her toward the main shaft as rocks began to fall. The crushing weight on her foot, the hours of agony before rescuers reached her. "You tried to save them," she whispered. "The miners." Failed. The word held years of self-recrimination. "Got 16 out. Not enough." "My father?" Thorne's silence was answer enough. "He went back for others," Emmeline said, the pieces finally connecting. "After getting me to the main shaft. That's why they never found his body." Thorne nodded once. "Brave man, foolish but brave." They sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. Finally, Emmeline asked the question that had been nagging at her since Providence Hill. "Why did you come for me at the chapel?" "The real reason." Thorne met her gaze directly. "Blackwater Mining has been buying up land claims and mineral rights throughout the territory. Your father owned shares in the competing operation, Silverline Mining." Shock rippled through her. "My father never mentioned any mining investments." He was a silent partner, trying to establish safer working conditions by becoming part owner. Thorne's voice hardened. "Caldwell Sr. is Blackwater's legal counsel, has been for 20 years. And Preston handles their land acquisitions. When he learned Judge Harper's daughter was still alive, he arranged your correspondence." Emmeline whispered, the pieces falling into place. "The marriage was never about me." "Marriage would have given him legal claim to everything you own, including those shares." Thorne hesitated. "When he saw your foot, he realized he could publicly reject you, make you desperate enough to sign over any assets just to leave town." The calculated cruelty staggered her. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me the truth." Thorne nodded once, then surprised her by reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, almost tender. "Try to sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." As Emmeline returned to bed, her mind whirled with revelations. Her father's hidden investment, her humiliation at the altar, all orchestrated by the same people responsible for the mine collapse that had killed her father and crippled her. And Thorne, carrying the weight of his own perceived failure, had recognized the pattern and intervened. They were both survivors, bearing scars, hers hidden beneath her skirts, his exposed for all to judge. But tonight, in sharing their wounds, something had shifted between them. Trust, perhaps, or something deeper that neither was ready to name. Sleep claimed her eventually, but her dreams were filled with falling rocks, wedding bells, and a pair of mismatched eyes watching over her through the darkness. Morning arrived with an unexpected peace. Emmeline woke to find Thorne already gone from the cabin, a note on the table explaining he'd ridden to check the perimeter of his property. Beside the note sat a walking stick, carefully carved from hardwood, the handle smoothed to fit a hand. Precisely. Her hand, she realized as she tested it. He'd made this for her, crafted it while she slept, perhaps during his own sleepless hours. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her more deeply than any words could have. Using the stick, Emmeline made her way to the small stream behind the cabin. The cool water soothed her face as she washed away the remnants of yesterday's emotions. For the first time since the accident, she found herself thinking not of what she had lost, but of what might still be possible. Her father had believed in justice enough to risk his own money to create change. Could she do any less with the legacy he had left her? When Thorne returned mid-morning, she was waiting on the porch, the walking stick in one hand, her mother's Bible in the other. "I'm not leaving," she said before he could speak. "Not yet." Surprise flickered across his scarred face. "Caldwell won't stop coming. Then we'll have to be ready when he does." Emmeline met his gaze steadily. "My father fought them in court and lost. You fought them with a badge and lost. Perhaps it's time for a different approach. What did you have in mind?" A smile touched her lips, the first genuine one since arriving in Providence Hill. "I believe you're a bounty hunter, Mr. Blackwell. Shall we discuss what justice might cost the Caldwells?" For the first time, she saw Thorne Blackwell smile, a transformation that erased years from his face and brought a warmth to his mismatched eyes that made her heart skip. "Miss Harper," he said, extending his hand to help her rise, "I believe this may be the beginning of an interesting partnership." She took his hand, feeling strength flow between them. Whatever came next, whether justice or danger or something unexpected, they would face it together. Two broken people, finding in each other what the world had tried to take from them: purpose, dignity, and perhaps, eventually, healing. A violent storm descended that night, trapping Emmeline and Thorn in the cabin for 3 days. Wind howled through the pines like lost souls, and rain hammered the roof in relentless sheets. The creek behind the cabin swelled to a churning torrent, cutting off the eastern trail to River Junction. Nature herself seemed determined to keep them together. In that forced proximity, they began to truly know each other. While the rain pounded the roof and thunder shook the timbers, Emmeline discovered the last letter her father had written, preserved. Among Thorn's few personal possessions, he sent it the day before the collapse, Thorn explained, as she traced her father's handwriting with trembling fingers. Warning me about unsafe conditions in the North Shaft. I was a day too late. The pages detailed Blackwater Mining's negligence, missing support beams, inadequate ventilation, tampered safety equipment. Judge Harper had been building a case for criminal charges, not just civil penalties. He never told me, Emmeline whispered. He protected me from how dangerous it really was. He protected everyone, Thorn replied. Found evidence the company was bribing inspectors. Realized the only way to fight them was from within. On the second night of the storm, Emmeline examined the old injury in Thorn's shoulder, a bullet, wound that had never healed properly. The scar tissue had limited his range of motion for years. "Who shot you?" she asked, preparing a hot compress from herbs she'd found in his medical supplies. Thorn hesitated. "Harrison Caldwell, Preston's father, when I tried to arrest him for conspiracy after the mine collapse." Emmeline's hand stilled on his shoulder. "The shooting that ended your career as marshal. The official report says I drew first." His voice was flat. 3 witnesses, all Blackwater employees, swore to it. "And the truth? He shot me through his coat pocket while I was reading the warrant." Bitterness crept into his voice. "Claimed self-defense. His son, a judge in Silverton County, dismissed all charges. So you became a bounty hunter." The law failed, decided to work outside it. His mismatched eyes met hers. "Not proud of all I've done, but I've never brought in a man who didn't deserve judgment." Her fingers worked the knots in his shoulder, finding the places where tension held his pain. "You're not what they say you are." "Maybe I am," he replied quietly. "Maybe I've become exactly what they made me." In return for her care, he showed her how to use the rifle, insisting she learn despite her initial reluctance. "I've never fired a gun," she admitted, the weight of it awkward in her hands. "Pray you never need to," Thorn replied, adjusting her grip with patient hands. "But if the time comes, better to know how." Emmeline was surprised by how precisely he taught, breaking down each movement into simple steps that accommodated her limited mobility. By the 3rd attempt, she hit the tin can he'd placed on a stump 50 yards from the porch. "You're a natural," he said, something like pride in his voice. That night, as they sat before the fire with the storm still raging outside, Thorn asked, "Why aren't you afraid of me? Most people can't even look at this." He gestured to his scarred face. "I've seen worse in my father's courtroom," she replied simply. "Men whose souls were scarred far deeper than your face. A person's appearance tells you nothing about their character. And yet you were judged for your foot by small minds. In Providence Hill," she smiled ruefully, "just as you were judged for your scars. We make quite the pair, don't we? The cripple and the killer." "Don't call yourself that." The sudden sharpness in his voice surprised her. "You're not defined by your foot any more than I'm defined by my face." "What are we defined by, then?" His gaze held hers, firelight reflecting in his mismatched eyes. "The choices we make when the world has done its worst to us." When Emmeline lost her balance fetching water from the rain barrel the next morning, Thorn caught her with surprising speed, his hands steady at her waist. For a moment, they stood close, something unspoken passing between them before he stepped back, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you," she murmured, more affected by his nearness than she wanted to admit. "Always," he replied, the single word holding a promise neither of them had expected. The storm had changed them both. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but two people finding unexpected strength in each other's company. Partners, perhaps, though in what, neither could yet define. On the fourth day, the sun emerged, turning the forest into a cathedral of light. Streams of golden radiance filtered through the pines, and the sodden earth released a rich, living smell. Thorn rode out at dawn to assess the trail conditions, returning mid-morning with news. "Road to River Junction is washed out," he reported, dismounting with fluid grace. "But the western trail is clear. We could reach Thorndale by nightfall, if we needed to." "Is that necessary?" Emmeline asked, looking up from the vegetable garden she'd been weeding. The walking stick he'd made her leaned against the cabin wall, already becoming an extension of herself. Not yet. Thorn unsaddled his stallion with practiced movements. "But Preston Caldwell doesn't strike me as the type to surrender easily. Sooner or later he'll send more than his brother with empty threats." As if conjured by his words, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Not a single rider this time, multiple horses approaching from the western trail. "Inside, now." Thorn's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "Take the rifle. Remember what I showed you." Heart pounding, Emmeline grabbed her walking stick and hurried into the cabin. Through the window, she watched Thorn position himself on the porch, seemingly relaxed but coiled for action. One hand rested casually near his holster, while the other held a cup of coffee, a man simply enjoying the morning, not preparing for confrontation. 5 riders emerged from the tree line. Preston Caldwell led them, his tailored riding coat impeccable despite the muddy trail. Sheriff Ellis rode beside him, looking uncomfortable. Behind them came Deputy Samuel Caldwell and 2 rough-looking men Emmeline didn't recognize. Hired. Guns, judging by their hard faces and the way they scanned the clearing with professional assessment. "Blackwell," Preston called, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I see you've made yourself comfortable with what belongs to me." Thorn sipped his coffee. "Nothing here belongs to you, Caldwell." "I disagree." Preston smiled thinly. "Miss Harper and I had a binding agreement. She accepted my marriage settlement, $50 in good faith, which she has failed to return following her breach of contract." "There's no contract," Thorn replied evenly. "You abandoned her at the altar. Any agreement was void the moment you humiliated her in front of the entire town." "A simple misunderstanding." Preston's voice dripped false regret. "I was shocked by her condition, spoke hastily. I'm prepared to forgive her deception." "How magnanimous." Thorn's tone remained conversational, but Emmeline could see tension in his shoulders. "And if she chooses not to return with you?" Preston's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. Sheriff Ellis has a warrant for her arrest on charges of theft." Emmeline's breath caught. From her position, she could see the sheriff shift uncomfortably in his saddle. "Show me this warrant," Thorn said, setting down his coffee cup. The sheriff reluctantly produced a folded paper. "Judge Harmon signed it yesterday in Providence Hill." "Harmon." Thorn's laugh held no humor. "Your father's poker partner. How convenient." "The law is the law," Preston replied smoothly, "even for former marshals who should know better. Miss Harper can either return the $50 and come with me to resolve this matter civilly, or she can be arrested and face trial." Thorn's stance shifted subtly. "And what about her shares in Silverline Mining? Will those be resolved as well?" A flash of surprise crossed Preston's face before he masked it. "I have no idea what you're talking about, don't you? Isn't that why you arranged this entire charade? To get control of Judge Harper's mining interests?" Preston's face hardened. You're delusional, Blackwell. This is about a breach of contract, nothing more. It's about greed, Thorne countered. Same greed that led your father's client to cut corners in that mine 3 years ago. Same greed that killed 32 men, including Judge Harper. The sheriff's head snapped up. That's a serious accusation. I was there, Thorne replied, his eyes never leaving Preston. I saw what Blackwater did. So did Judge Harper. That's why he bought into Silverline, to fight them from within. And that's why your father made sure all evidence disappeared after the collapse. Preston's pleasant facade cracked. You have no proof of any of this, don't I? Thorne's smile was dangerous. Why do you think I've been watching Providence Hill for the past month? Building a case, gathering witnesses, former miners willing to testify about falsified safety. Reports, families of the dead ready to swear to bribes they were offered to stay quiet. A muscle twitched in Preston's jaw. Sheriff, are you going to serve that warrant or not? Sheriff Ellis looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Caldwell, if what Blackwell says has any merit, the warrant, Sheriff, Preston snapped, or I'll have your badge by sundown. Inside the cabin, Emmeline made a decision. Gripping her walking stick, she pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch beside Thorne. Miss Harper, the sheriff acknowledged, surprise evident in his face. Are you here of your own free will? I am, she replied steadily, and I won't be returning to Providence Hill with Mr. Caldwell. Preston's face darkened. You have no choice. Either return my $50 and come willingly, or go in chains. I have another option. Emmeline reached into her pocket and withdrew. Her father's pocket watch, a heavy gold timepiece worth far more than $50. She tossed it to the sheriff, who caught it reflexively. Consider the debt paid in full. Sheriff Ellis examined the watch, clearly recognizing its value. This more than covers it. That's not acceptable, Preston sputtered. The arrangement was satisfied, the sheriff interrupted firmly. She's paid her debt, Mr. Caldwell. The warrant is void. Preston's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're making a serious mistake, Ellis. Maybe. The sheriff tucked the watch into his vest. But I'm starting to think it's not the only mistake I've made recently. He turned to Thorne. I want to hear more about these witnesses you've gathered. Before Thorne could respond, Preston nodded to the two hired guns. Enough of this farce. Take the woman and deal with Blackwell. The men reached for their weapons, but Thorne was faster. His hand moved in a blur, drawing and aiming in one fluid motion. I wouldn't, he said quietly. The hired guns froze, weighing their options. From their expressions, Emmeline could see them recalculating the odds. Thorne's reputation hadn't been exaggerated. This is how you want it to end, Preston? Thorne asked, his voice deadly calm. Blood on your hands, witnesses to murder, including a sheriff. Your father might buy your way out of theft charges, but not this. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Sheriff Ellis did something unexpected. He turned his horse sideways, blocking Preston's men, and rested his hand on his own pistol. Stand down, he ordered. All of you. There'll be no shooting today. Deputy Samuel Caldwell looked uncertainly between his brother and the sheriff. Preston, maybe we should— Shut up, Sam, Preston hissed. His face had gone white with fury. This isn't over, Blackwell, not by a long shot. Ride out, Thorne suggested mildly, while you still can. With a final venomous glare, Preston yanked his horse around and spurred it toward the trees. The hired guns followed, but Deputy Caldwell hesitated. Sam, the sheriff said quietly, make your choice, son. After a moment's indecision, the young deputy nodded to Thorne and Emmeline, then followed his brother, though at a more measured pace. Sheriff Ellis remained, watching until the others disappeared into the forest. Only— Then did he turn back to Thorne. I owe you an apology, he said gruffly. Believed what I was told about you. Thorne lowered his pistol but didn't holster it. And now I'm wondering what else I've been wrong about. The sheriff glanced at Emmeline, including what really happened at that mine. Emmeline straightened her spine. My father was building a case against Blackwater Mining when he died. He believed they were criminally negligent. He was right, Thorne added. I have his documentation, names of witnesses, evidence of falsified safety reports. The sheriff rubbed his moustache thoughtfully. Why come to me now? Why not take this to the territorial authorities? Tried that, Thorne replied. 3 years. Ago, got a bullet for my trouble and a dishonorable discharge from the Marshal's service. The Caldwells have influence, Ellis acknowledged. But they don't own everyone. Just most, Emmeline said bitterly. The sheriff's weathered face softened as he looked at her. Your father was respected, Miss Harper. There are still people in Providence Hill who remember him with honor, people who might listen if his daughter spoke the truth. Hope flickered in Emmeline's chest, a fragile thing she hardly dared nurture. You think it's possible to bring them to justice? After all this time? I think, Ellis said carefully, that Preston Caldwell just tried to have a man killed in front of a county sheriff. That gives us leverage we didn't have before. Thorne's expression remained skeptical, and Harrison Caldwell, he's the real power. Every man has weaknesses, the sheriff replied. Even Harrison. He gathered his reins. I need to get back before they realize I'm not following. We'll communicate through Jacob at the livery. He can be trusted. As Ellis prepared to leave, Emmeline called out, Why help us? You barely know me, and you've believed the worst of Thorne until today. The sheriff's eyes held a shadow of old pain. My brother worked that mine, was one of the 32. He touched the brim of his hat. Justice comes slow to these parts, Miss Harper. But it does come. They watched him ride away, neither speaking until he disappeared among the trees. Finally, Thorne holstered his pistol and turned to Emmeline. You shouldn't have come out, he said, though there was no real reproach in his voice. It was dangerous. So is letting others decide my fate, she replied steadily. I've had enough of that. A reluctant smile touched his lips. That was quick. In thinking with the watch, it was my father's, worth far more than $50, but I would have paid 10 times that to see Preston's face. Thorne's expression grew serious. He'll be back, with more men next time. And Ellis may have good intentions, but he's one man against the Caldwell machine. Then we'd better be ready. Emmeline met his gaze, unflinching. You've been building a case for 3 years. I think it's time we used it. That night, Thorne spread his gathered evidence across the table, sworn statements from former miners, medical reports documenting safety violations, financial records showing bribes paid to inspectors. Pieced together, they told a damning story of corporate greed and calculated disregard for human life. The problem isn't evidence, Thorne explained as Emmeline examined the documents. It's getting anyone to act on it. The Caldwells have judges and politicians in their pockets throughout the territory. Then we go above them, Emmeline said, thinking aloud. The territorial governor, Thorne shook his head, tried that route. Governor's office referred it back to local authorities. The federal courts, then. Possible, but slow. Could take years. Emmeline tapped her fingers on the table, considering. What about the newspapers? The Providence Hill Gazette is owned by the Caldwells, but the River Junction Chronicle is independent, and the Territorial Tribune in the capital has a reputation for exposing corruption. Interest flickered in Thorne's mismatched eyes. Public exposure. Hit them where it hurts. Their reputation. Blackwater Mining relies on investors, Emmeline continued, warming to the idea. Most of whom are back east. If those investors learned their money was funding deadly negligence, they'd pull out, Thorne finished. Harrison Caldwell's entire empire could collapse. For the first time, Emmeline felt real hope, not just for justice, but for a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. We could do this. Together. Thorne's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. It won't be easy or safe. The Caldwells will come at us with everything they have. I'm not afraid, she said, surprised to realize it was true. The timid, self-conscious woman who had arrived in Providence Hill seeking a husband to rescue her was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, forged in pain, tempered by betrayal, finding her power at last. What happens after? Thorne asked, quietly. If we succeed, the question caught her off guard. She hadn't thought beyond justice, hadn't dared to consider what might follow. I don't know, she admitted. Perhaps I'll use my father's shares to make Silverline the kind of mining operation he envisioned, one that values men's lives above profit. A worthy goal. Thorne's expression was unreadable. You'd be good at it. And you? She asked, suddenly afraid of his answer. What will you do when this is finished? He was silent for a long moment, his scarred face thoughtful in the lamplight. Never thought much beyond survival, he finally said. Finding justice for those miners consumed me for 3 years. And now, his mismatched eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. Now, I'm finding reasons to think about a future, one I never expected. The weight of his words settled between them, full of possibility neither was quite ready to name. Instead of speaking, Emmeline reached across the table and laid her hand over his fingers turned, intertwining with hers, rough calluses against her softer skin. They stayed like that, connected in the quiet cabin, as night deepened around them. Tomorrow would bring danger and difficult choices. But tonight, in this moment of perfect understanding, they had found something neither had been looking for, a partnership that transcended their wounds, a connection that defied the broken, paths that had led them here, and perhaps, though neither dared say it aloud, the beginning of healing for them both. The golden light of dawn had barely broken through the pines when Thorne and Emmeline set their plan in motion. They traveled light, Thorne on his black stallion, Emmeline on the dappled mare, with only essential supplies and the precious documents, secured in oilcloth against her chest. The forest trail to River Junction would take them a full day's ride, avoiding the main roads where Preston's men might be watching. Stay close, Thorne instructed as they entered a narrow ravine. This territory can be unpredictable. Emmeline nodded, her newfound confidence tempered by practicality. The walking stick he'd carved for her was secured to her saddle, within easy reach. In her boot, she carried a small derringer, another of Thorne's precautions, taught with patience. Hence the previous evening, just in case we're separated, he'd explained, showing her how to load and fire the small weapon. The weight of it felt foreign against her ankle, but also reassuring. A last resort she prayed she'd never need. They rode in watchful silence, senses alert to any sound that didn't belong to the forest. Birds called overhead, and occasionally a rabbit or deer startled at their approach, but otherwise the wilderness offered peaceful passage. By midday they'd covered nearly half the distance to River Junction. They paused to rest the horses beside a small stream, sharing a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. When we reach town, Thorne said, studying the crude map he'd drawn, we'll split up, less conspicuous. You'll take the documents to Elijah Morgan at the Chronicle, while I secure our passage east. Emmeline frowned. Is separation wise? The Caldwells might have men watching the town. That's why we need to divide their attention. Thorne's face was grim. Morgan's printing office is 3 blocks from the stage depot. If trouble comes, it'll likely find me first, using yourself as bait, she observed, not liking the implication. He shrugged. I'm more difficult to handle than you, no offense. Plenty taken, she retorted, though without heat. What if they catch you? The evidence won't matter if you're dead. Something flickered in his mismatched eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. Won't happen. I've evaded better men than Preston Caldwell's hired thugs. Your confidence is admirable, if misplaced. Emmeline brushed crumbs from her skirt. We should stay together, safety in numbers. Sometimes, he countered, safety comes from diversion. Trust me on this, Emmeline. I've spent years hunting men who didn't want to be found. I know how they think." Before she could argue further, a sound caught their attention, hoofbeats on the trail behind them. Multiple riders moving fast. "Damn," Thorn muttered, drawing his pistol. "They're tracking us." Emmeline's heart pounded. "How?" "We were careful. Someone in Providence Hill must have seen us leave." He scanned the terrain swiftly. "There's no outrunning them, not with the horses tired." Decision made, he led her to a rocky outcropping that offered both cover and elevation. "Stay here," he ordered, helping her dismount. "If things go wrong, take the North Trail. Morgan's a good man. He'll help you even without me." "Thorn!" Fear clutched at her throat, not for herself, but for him. He touched her cheek briefly, a gesture so unexpected it stole her breath. "Stay alive," he said softly. "The rest is negotiable." Then he was gone, leading both horses away from her position, deliberately leaving tracks in the soft earth. Drawing their pursuers away from her hiding place, Emmeline crouched behind the rocks, derringer in hand, praying for the skill to use it if necessary. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the sound of approaching riders grew louder. She counted at least 4, possibly 5. They came into view on the trail below. Preston's hired guns, heavily armed, following Thorn's trail with single-minded focus. Thankfully, none thought to look up to the rocky ledge where she hid. They passed directly beneath her, close enough that she could smell tobacco and sweat, hear their crude conversation. "Blackwell's mine," the lead rider declared, a bearded brute with a knife scar across his chin. "Caldwell's paying double if he's brought in alive." "What about the woman?" another asked. The leader shrugged. "Alive, preferably." But Caldwell didn't specify condition. Cold dread washed through Emmeline at the callous words. These men weren't lawmen serving a warrant. They were mercenaries with a bounty, hunters who had come for the hunter. When they passed from sight, Emmeline faced a terrible choice: follow Thorn's instructions and head north, or try to warn him of the odds he faced. The sensible decision was clear. The evidence she carried was too important to risk, yet she could not abandon him. Not when he had refused to abandon her. Using her walking stick for support, she began picking her way down from the outcropping, following the trail of the hunters at a safe distance. Her twisted foot made the descent treacherous, but determination drove her forward. If she could just get close enough to see what was happening without being spotted, the sound of gunfire cracked through the forest, 1 shot, then 3 in rapid succession. Birds exploded from the trees in panicked flight, then silence, heavy and terrible. Emmeline quickened her pace, heart in her throat. The path ahead opened into a small clearing where the stream widened into a shallow pool. From her position at the edge of the trees, she could see everything. Thorn was on one knee beside the water, blood staining his left arm. His pistol remained in his right hand, pointed steadily at the 3 men surrounding him. 2 others lay motionless on the ground. "Drop it, Blackwell," the bearded leader ordered, his own weapon trained on Thorn's head. "You're outnumbered. Caldwell wants you alive, but he'll settle for dead." "Interesting proposition," Thorn replied, his voice steady despite his injury. "But I've got a better one. You boys ride out now. I forget your faces. Everyone lives." The men laughed. "You're in no position to negotiate." "Aren't I?" Thorn's expression remained calm. 2 of you are already down. How many more want to die today?" The leader's face hardened. "Last chance. The bounty hunter becomes the bounty. Ironic, ain't it?" From her hidden position, Emmeline assessed the situation with growing horror. The men were positioned to flank Thorn. Even if he shot one, the others would have clear shots. She had to create a diversion. Hands trembling, she aimed the derringer at a point above and beyond the men, where a stand of dry brush crowded the edge of the clearing. 1 shot, 1 chance. The tiny gun roared in her hand, startlingly loud in the tense silence. The effect was immediate. All heads turned toward the unexpected sound, just long enough for Thorn to take advantage. His first shot caught the leader in the chest. His second found the man to his right. The third gunman fired wildly before turning to flee, but Thorn's final bullet brought him down at the edge of the clearing. When the echoes faded, only Thorn remained standing, scanning the trees with deadly focus. "Emmeline," he called, voice tight with concern. "Is that you?" She stepped from her hiding place, Derringer still clutched in her shaking hand. "I couldn't leave you." Relief and fury warred on his face. "I told you to go north, and I chose not to listen." She approached him cautiously, eyeing his bloody arm. "You're hurt." "Graze." He holstered his weapon and examined the wound with detached interest. "Not serious." Emmeline surveyed the clearing, bile rising in her throat at the sight of the fallen men. "You killed them." They didn't leave much choice. Thorn's expression was grim. "They wouldn't have shown you mercy. Remember that." She nodded, suddenly understanding the weight he carried. This man who had killed, not from cruelty or pleasure, but from the brutal necessity of a world where justice and law were separate things. "We need to move," he said, collecting the reins of his stallion from where he'd tied it at the edge of the clearing. "News of this will reach Preston Caldwell by nightfall." "The horses are exhausted," Emmeline pointed out, seeing the way Thorn's mount drooped despite its imposing size. He hesitated, clearly calculating risks. "There's a line shack about 2 miles east, used by railroad surveyors last year. We can rest there until dark, then push on to River Junction under cover of night." The shack proved to be little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a small stove and single cot. While Thorn tended the horses in the lean-to outside, Emmeline cleaned and bandaged his wound, using supplies from the small medical kit he carried. "You have gentle hands," he observed as she tied off the bandage, "like your father." "He taught me basic field medicine," she replied, focusing on her task rather than the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "Said a judge in these territories. Needed to know how to stitch a wound as well as settle a dispute." Thorn's good eye studied her face. "You miss him." "Every day." She secured the bandage with a small pin. "But now, at least, I have purpose, a way to honor his memory beyond mere survival." As evening approached, they shared a meager meal of remaining provisions, speaking little but finding comfort in shared silence. Emmeline used the time to review the evidence they carried, organizing the documents for presentation to the newspaper editor. "These sworn testimonies from the miners' widows are particularly damning," she noted, arranging the papers by date. "And the forged safety certificates with Harrison Caldwell's notary stamp that connects him directly to the fraud." Thorn nodded, cleaning his pistol with methodical precision. "Morgan will know what to do with them. He's been trying to expose the Caldwells for years, but never had enough proof. And once the story is published, we take copies to the federal marshal in Silver City. With public exposure, they won't be able to bury it again." A question that had been nagging at her finally surfaced. "Why did you wait so long?" "You've had this evidence for months, perhaps years." Thorn's hands stilled on his weapon. "Needed all the pieces, witness testimonies, financial records proving the bribes, and most importantly, a survivor they couldn't silence." Emmeline. Finished understanding dawning. "Me. You're Judge Harper's daughter. Your testimony carries weight that mine doesn't." His mismatched eyes met hers. "A disgraced marshal's word means nothing. A respected judge's daughter speaking the truth about her father's death? That's harder to dismiss." "That's why Preston arranged to court me," she said slowly. "Not just for the mining shares, but to control the last person who could testify against them." "Marriage would have silenced you legally and socially," Thorn confirmed. "When he saw your foot, he gambled that public humiliation would make you desperate enough to accept any terms. But you intervened. I couldn't let them win again." Something vulnerable flickered across his scarred face. couldn't let them break someone else. Night had fallen by the time they departed the line shack, riding under a sky scattered with stars. The horses, rested but still weary, maintained a steady pace along the eastern trail. According to Thorne's estimation, they would reach River Junction shortly before dawn, ideal timing to find Morgan at the newspaper office as he prepared the morning edition. They rode mostly in silence, alert for any sign of pursuit. But the forest remained quiet. The only sounds, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. "Tell me about your plans," Thorne said unexpectedly as they navigated a shallow stream crossing. "After this is finished." The question caught Emmeline off guard. "Assuming we succeed." "Assuming you survive," he corrected grimly. "The rest is just details." She considered this as her mare picked its way carefully through the water. "I've never had the luxury of making plans. After the accident, survival consumed all my energy. Then came the correspondence with Preston, and I allowed myself to hope for a life beyond mere existence. And now I know hope isn't enough." Determination hardened her voice. "I want to build something from what my father left. Use the Silverline shares to create the kind of mining operation he envisioned. One where profit doesn't come at the cost of men's lives." Pride flickered in Thorne's expression. "You'd be good at it. You have your father's sense of justice and your own strength." "And you?" she asked, returning his question. "What does Thorne Blackwell do when he's no longer hunting the Caldwells?" He was silent so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was contemplative. "Been a hunter for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be. Anything else?" His scarred profile was silhouetted against the star-strewn sky. "Maybe that's all I am now, what they made me." "I don't believe that," Emmeline said quietly. "The man who carved me a walking stick, who taught me to shoot, who risked his life for justice. He's more than what was done to him." Thorne's mismatched eyes found hers in the darkness. "You see more in me than is there, Emmeline Harper. Or perhaps I see what you've forgotten how to see in yourself." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Eventually, Thorne cleared his throat. "River Junction's just beyond that ridge," he said, gesturing ahead. "We should reach it by first light." The town emerged from the pre-dawn mist like a promise, a cluster of buildings straddling the junction of the Silver River and the Eastern Railroad. Unlike Providence Hill with its coal dust and mining scars, River Junction had the prosperous air of a transportation hub. Freight warehouses lined the river, while the railroad depot dominated the eastern edge of town. "Morgan's newspaper office is on Front Street," Thorne explained as they approached the outskirts. "The Chronicle has the bottom floor. He lives above it. We'll stable the horses at Whitman's livery 2 blocks south, then approach separately." "I still don't like splitting up," Emmeline protested. "It's safer," Thorne insisted. "I'll secure our passage east while you deliver the documents. Meet at the depot at noon. And if you don't come." His expression softened at the worry in her voice. "I'll be there. But if something happens, don't wait. Take the eastbound train to Silver City. Ask for Marshal Holden. He's one of the few who can't be bought." The streets were beginning to stir with early morning activity as they stabled their horses. Wagons rolled toward the warehouses, and railway workers trudged to the depot for the day shift. No one paid particular attention to a scarred man and a woman with a twisted foot, just 2 more travelers passing through. At the edge of Front Street they paused. The Chronicle's office was visible a block away, lanterns already lit inside as the day's edition was prepared. "Be careful," Thorne said, adjusting the saddlebag containing her personal belongings. "Morgan's trustworthy but cautious by nature. Tell him I sent you. Show him the evidence, but don't leave it. We'll need the originals for the marshal." Emmeline nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from him. "And you? Where will you go?" "To arrange our passage east. 3 options: stage, rail, or riverboat. Best to have alternatives." His hand briefly touched hers. Noon at the depot, no matter what. As she watched him walk away, Emmeline felt a curious mixture of fear and determination. The bundle of documents pressed against her chest like a shield and a burden both. In them lay the truth about her father's death, the corruption of the Caldwells, and the path to justice denied for 3 long years. With her walking stick providing steady support, she made her way toward the Chronicle office. The sign above the door proclaimed it, the voice of the territory, in bold letters. Through the large front window, she could see a balding man in suspenders setting type at a printing press. Elijah Morgan, the man who might finally help them. Bring the truth to light. As she reached for the door handle, a flicker of movement across the street caught her attention. A man stepped from the shadows of the mercantile porch, his face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Something about his posture sent warning signals through her mind. Before she could react, another man appeared at the corner, then a third further down the street. None wore badges or uniforms, but their purpose was clear in the way they moved, converging. On her position, with deliberate intent, Preston Caldwell's men. Somehow they had anticipated their destination. Clutching the documents tighter, Emmeline made a split-second decision. Instead of entering the newspaper office, she turned sharply and began moving toward the busy market square 2 blocks away. There, among the morning shoppers and merchants, she might lose her pursuers long enough to circle back. The men immediately changed course to follow, no longer bothering with subtlety. She increased her pace, her twisted foot protesting with each step. The walking stick Thorne had carved provided stability but not speed. Heart-pounding, she slipped between market stalls, weaving through crowds of shoppers. Behind her she heard angry exclamations as her pursuers pushed people aside. They were gaining. Where was Thorne? Had he been ambushed as well? The thought sent fresh fear coursing through her. Ahead, the street opened into the town square, dominated by a small courthouse. If she could reach it, perhaps find a sheriff or deputy. A hand grabbed her arm, yanking her into the narrow space between 2 buildings. She opened her mouth to scream, but another hand covered it firmly. Quiet. A familiar voice ordered in her ear. "It's me." Relief washed through her as Thorne released his hold. "They're everywhere," she whispered. "How did they find us so quickly?" Telegram, most likely. They'd been watching both trail approaches to town. His expression was grim. Plans have changed. Morgan's not an option now. Too exposed. Then what do we do? The stage? He shook his head. Stations watch too. But there's another way. He gestured toward the river, visible beyond the buildings. Lumber barge leaving in 20 minutes. Captain's an old friend. He'll take us downriver to Fort Garland. And the evidence? All our plans? Survival first, Thorne said firmly. Justice follows. As her pursuers' voices grew closer, Emmeline made her choice. She reached inside her coat and separated the documents, handing half to Thorne. If we're separated, at least some of the truth might survive, she explained. Understanding flickered in his mismatched eyes. He took the papers, securing them inside his coat. Stay close. When we move fast. Together, they slipped through the narrow alley toward the riverfront, where their next challenge, and perhaps their last chance at justice, awaited. The lumber barge creaked beneath their feet as it pulled away from the river junction dock, loaded with pine and cedar destined for settlements downriver. Captain Malcolm Reed, a grizzled veteran of the river trade, had greeted Thorne with a firm handshake and knowing eyes, asking no questions as he ushered them aboard and hidden them among the stacked timber. "Stay low until we clear the bend," the captain advised, his voice barely audible above the river's flow. Caldwell's men were asking questions at the warehouse. Won't be long before they check the waterfront. From their concealed position between 2 massive stacks of lumber, Emmeline and Thorne watched River Junction recede. The morning sun glinted off windows and tin roofs, the town appearing deceptively peaceful from a distance. How did the captain know to help us? Emmeline whispered, adjusting her position to ease the pressure on her twisted foot. Reed's son worked the north shaft, Thorne replied, his eyes scanning the shoreline for pursuers. Died in the collapse. He's been waiting for this day as long as we have. As the barge rounded the river bend, putting River Junction out of sight, Captain Reed appeared with a worn canvas sack. Bit of breakfast, he offered, revealing bread, cheese, and 2 apples. Not fancy, but filling. We're grateful, Emmeline said, accepting the food. For everything. Reed's weathered face softened as he regarded her. Judge Harper was one of the good ones, fined me once for illegal fishing, then invited me to dinner to explain why the river laws mattered. He turned to Thorne. We'll reach Fort Garland by nightfall. My brother's the station master there. He can arrange passage east without questions. After Reed returned to his duties, Emmeline and Thorne examined their situation. The split bundles of evidence remained secure, but their immediate path forward was uncertain. Fort Garland has a telegraph office, Thorne mused, his scarred face thoughtful. We could wire Marshal Holden directly, tell him to meet us. Is he truly trustworthy? Doubt colored Emmeline's voice. After everything, I find it hard to believe in any lawman's integrity. Holden's different. Thorne's certainty was absolute. He's the one who warned me when Harrison Caldwell put a bounty on my head, risked his career to give me time to disappear. And yet you didn't take your evidence to him before now. Evidence without a witness is just paper, Thorne replied. I needed you. His mismatched eyes held hers. Needed someone the territorial court would believe. The river journey passed in relative peace, the gentle rocking of the barge, lulling them into much-needed rest. Thorne checked his wound, satisfied, to find no signs of infection, while Emmeline used the time to organize their documentation into a coherent narrative. If we present this correctly, she said, arranging the papers chronologically, the pattern becomes undeniable. Not just negligence, but deliberate disregard for safety to maximize profit. Thorne nodded, impressed by her methodical approach. You would have made a fine lawyer. My father hoped I might be. Before the accident. She touched her twisted foot, absently. After, it seemed impossible. And now, a small smile touched her lips. Now I understand that impossible is often just a matter of perspective. As afternoon faded toward evening, the landscape changed. Dense forests gave way to rolling grasslands, and the river widened as it approached the junction with the wider Missouri. Ahead, the smokestacks of Fort Garland appeared, a military outpost turned transportation hub, standing sentinel at the convergence of river and rail. We'll dock in 20 minutes, Captain Reed informed them, returning to their hiding place. William's waiting at the lower wharf. He'll take you directly to the station master's office. Thorne tensed suddenly, his gaze fixed on the riverbank. We have company. Following his line of sight, Emmeline spotted them, 4 riders moving parallel to the barge, keeping pace along the shoreline. Even at a distance, their purposeful movement was unmistakable. Caldwell's men, she whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. They must have telegraphed ahead. Thorne's voice was tight with controlled anger. Cut us off before we could reach the fort. Captain Reed squinted at the riders, then spat over the side. Persistent bastards. Good thing we're not docking at the main wharf. He pointed to a smaller landing, partially obscured by a stand of cottonwoods. William will be waiting there instead, with horses. As the barge approached the hidden dock, Thorne helped Emmeline gather their meager belongings. The wound in his arm clearly pained him, though he made no complaint. Their shared glance conveyed what words could not. Both understood the increasing stakes of their journey. Each obstacle overcome simply led to another, more dangerous challenge. William Reed proved to be a younger, leaner version of his brother. Same watchful eyes, same air of quiet competence. He greeted them with a brief nod as they disembarked. "Town's crawling with Caldwell's men," he informed them, leading 2 saddled horses from the cover of the trees. "Started arriving an hour ago. They're watching the station, the telegraph office, even the hotel." Thorne's expression darkened. "How many?" "At least 8 that I've seen, maybe more." William handed them the reins. "These will get you to Silver Creek. It's a full night's ride, but the moon's near full. Follow the old military road east." Silver Creek? Emmeline's breath caught at the mention of her childhood home. "Why there?" "Because it's the last place they'd expect you to go," Thorne explained, helping her mount despite his injured arm. "And because Judge Morris is there." "Samuel Morris?" Hope flickered in her chest. "My father's colleague from the territorial court?" Thorne nodded, swinging into his own saddle. "The one judge in the territory Harrison Caldwell hasn't been able to buy or intimidate. If anyone will hear our case, it's Morris." With whispered thanks to the Reed brothers, they set off under the cover of fading daylight, skirting the edges of Fort Garland to avoid detection. The old military road stretched before them, a pale ribbon in the gathering dusk. They rode in silence for the first hour, conserving energy and maintaining vigilance. Only when the fort disappeared behind them did Thorne relax marginally, dropping. "Back to ride alongside Emmeline. How's your foot?" he asked, noticing her occasional grimace. "Manageable," she replied, though the hours in the saddle had taken their toll. "I won't slow us down." His expression softened with unexpected tenderness. "That's not what I asked." "It hurts," she admitted finally. "But pain is a companion I've grown accustomed to." Thorne nodded, understanding in his mismatched eyes. "We'll rest at Willow Creek Crossing, 2 hours ahead." As promised, they reached the shallow crossing near midnight. While the horses drank from the clear stream, Emmeline stretched her cramped muscles, using her walking stick for support. The night was still, illuminated by a bright moon that cast silver light across the rolling prairie. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she observed, breathing in the sweet scent of grass and wildflowers. "Hard to believe something so peaceful exists in the same world as the Caldwells." Thorne approached with a small bundle of food, the last of what Captain Reed had provided. "That's why it's worth fighting for," he said quietly. "The parts of the world they haven't touched yet." They shared the simple meal in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts. When Emmeline glanced at Thorne, she found him watching her, an unreadable expression on his scarred face. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You've changed," he said simply, "since that day in the chapel, for better or worse." A rare smile touched his lips. "Definitely better. You carry yourself differently now, like you've remembered who you are." "Perhaps I'm discovering it for the first time," she replied, considering his words. "The accident took more than my mobility. It took my confidence, my sense of purpose." She gazed at the moon-silvered landscape. Strangely, it took being abandoned at the altar to find them again. "Fate has curious methods," Thorne observed wryly. "Indeed." Emmeline hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered unspoken between them. "What happens afterward, Thorne? If we succeed against the Caldwells, what then?" His scarred face grew solemn in the moonlight. "I've lived so long for this moment, I've hardly thought beyond it." "Try," she urged softly. "What would you want if you could choose freely?" Thorne was silent for a long moment, his mismatched eyes reflecting the stars above. "Peace," he finally said, "not just the absence of fighting, but something more. A purpose beyond vengeance, a place that feels like home." His gaze found hers. "Someone to share it with." The weight of his unspoken meaning hung between them, too fragile yet for direct acknowledgement. Emmeline felt her heart quicken, but before she could respond, Thorne stiffened, his attention caught by something beyond her. "Riders," he said tersely, reaching for his pistol. "Coming fast." In the distance, barely visible in the moonlight. Dust rose from approaching horsemen. At least 3, maybe 4, moving with purpose straight toward their position. How did they find us? Emmeline gasped, gathering their belongings with frantic haste. Someone at the fort must have spotted us leaving. Thorn helped her into the saddle, his movements efficient despite his evident concern. We need to reach the Miller's Ridge cutoff before they catch us. It's our only chance to lose them. They pushed their mounts harder than before, racing across the open prairie toward a dark line of trees marking the ridge. Behind them, their pursuers gained steadily, the sound of hoofbeats growing louder with each passing minute. "They're faster," Emmeline observed grimly. "Our horses are tired." Thorn's face was set in determined lines. "We just need to reach the trees. The ridge has hidden trails they won't know." The distance to the tree line seemed endless, stretching before them like a receding dream. Their horses, sensing the urgency, gave their all, but fatigue slowed their pace. The riders behind closed the gap with every stride. When the first shot rang out, whistling past Emmeline's ear, Thorn made a split-second decision. He pulled his horse alongside hers and pressed a folded packet into her hand. "My half of the evidence," he said, voice tight with urgency. "The ridge trail forks a quarter-mile in. Take the left path. It leads to an old trapper's cabin. Wait there until dawn, then continue to Silver Creek. Judge Morris lives at the north end of town." Horror dawned as she realized his intent. "No, we stay together. They'll catch us both at this rate." His scarred face was resolute. "I'll lead them away. Give you time." "Thorn, please, trust me, Emmeline." For a heartbeat his hand covered hers. "I'll find you." Before she could protest further, he veered sharply right, firing his pistol in the air and shouting to draw their pursuers' attention. The ruse worked. 3 of the 4 riders immediately changed course to follow him, believing he carried all the evidence. Tears blurring her vision, Emmeline drove her horse toward the ridge, the remaining pursuer close behind. The trees loomed, larger promising shelter if she could just reach them in time. Another shot cracked behind her, this one closer. Her mare, startled by the gunfire, surged forward with a burst of speed, crashing through the underbrush at the forest's edge. The dense canopy swallowed them, branches whipping past as they plunged. Deeper into shadow, the forest trail narrowed immediately, barely wide enough for a single rider. Behind her, she heard her pursuer slow, forced to navigate the unfamiliar terrain cautiously. The advantage shifted slightly in her favor. This was Thorn's territory, and he had prepared her well. When the path forked exactly as he'd described, Emmeline veered left without hesitation. The trail climbed steeply, switchbacking up the ridge, through increasingly dense vegetation. Her pursuer followed doggedly, but the gap between them widened as he struggled with the difficult terrain. At the ridge's crest, inspiration struck. Remembering Thorn's wilderness lessons, Emmeline guided her horse through a shallow stream for 50 yards, then backtracked and took a game trail branching east. The maneuver would confuse her tracks, buying precious time. The trapper's cabin appeared exactly where Thorn had indicated, a small, sturdy structure nestled in a clearing overlooking the valley. Emmeline dismounted painfully, her twisted foot nearly buckling after the hard ride. Leading her exhausted mare behind the cabin, she secured her in a small lean-to that offered concealment. Inside, the cabin was dusty but serviceable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while simple furnishings, a narrow cot, rough-hewn table and single chair, occupied the remaining space. Clearly one of Thorn's many bolt holes, stocked with basic provisions, and she discovered a loaded shotgun hanging above the door. Taking the weapon down, Emmeline positioned herself at the window overlooking the approach trail. Her pursuer would arrive soon, and she intended to be ready. The judge's daughter, raised on principles of law and justice, now prepared to defend herself with lethal force if necessary. The irony wasn't lost on her. Minutes stretched into an hour as she maintained her vigilant watch. The forest remained, quiet save for night creatures going about their business. Had she lost him, or was he simply biding his time, waiting for daylight to track her more effectively? More worrying was Thorn's fate. Had he escaped his pursuers, or had his diversion cost him his freedom, or worse, his life? The thought sent a wave of anguish through her. This man who had rescued her from public humiliation, who had shown her kindness when the world offered only pity, who had awakened in her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She couldn't lose him now, not when they were so close to justice, not when something unspoken but profound was growing between them. Dawn broke with agonizing slowness, painting the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Emmeline, having dozed fitfully without abandoning her post, started awake at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Heart pounding, she raised the shotgun, bracing it against her shoulder as Thorn had taught her. Through the grimy window, she watched the trail intently, finger hovering near the trigger. A lone rider appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving cautiously. Not one of their pursuers, but Sheriff Ellis from Providence Hill. Relief flooded through her until suspicion quickly replaced it. How had he found her? And why was he alone? Keeping the shotgun ready, Emmeline opened the cabin door a crack. "That's far enough, Sheriff," she called, voice steadier than she felt. "State your business." Ellis reined his horse, raising both hands, to show they were empty. "Miss Harper, thank God. Blackwell sent me to find you." Thorn. Hope and fear mingled in her chest. "Where is he?" "Wounded, but alive," Ellis replied grimly. "He's in Silver Creek. Judge Morris has him under protection." The sheriff dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "We need to move quickly. Harrison Caldwell's men are searching the entire ridge." Emmeline lowered the shotgun fractionally. "Prove you're telling the truth. How did Thorn know where I was?" Ellis's weathered face showed respect at her caution. "He said to tell you that fate has curious methods, that you'd understand." The tension drained from her shoulders. Those were indeed Thorn's words from the previous night, a phrase no one else could have known. He's truly alive? Yes, though. Not for lack of trying on Caldwell's part. Ellis approached carefully. 3 of them caught up to him at Serpent's Pass. He took down 2 before the third put a bullet in his leg. "I was tracking all of you and arrived just in time to prevent the finishing shot." Emmeline's legs weakened with relief. She leaned on her walking stick, fighting sudden tears. "And the evidence? His half? Safe with Judge Morris." Ellis glanced nervously at the tree line. "We need to go, Miss Harper. Harrison Caldwell himself is reportedly on his way from Providence Hill. This is about to get much worse." Pushing exhaustion aside, Emmeline gathered the precious documents and mounted her still-tired mare. With Sheriff Ellis leading the way, they took a different trail down the ridge, a barely visible path that zigzagged through dense underbrush before joining an old logging road. "Morris has called an emergency session of the Territorial Court," Ellis explained as they rode. 3 judges, including himself. If they rule there's sufficient evidence, they can issue warrants for the Caldwells that not even their money can dismiss. And Thorn, his injuries. Doctor says he's lucky. The bullet passed clean through, no bones hit. Ellis's expression grew serious. "He was more worried about you than himself. Wouldn't let the doctor tend him until I promised to find you." Emotion tightened Emmeline's throat. Even wounded, Thorn's first thought had been for her safety. The realization cemented something that had been building in her heart since that fateful day in the Providence Hill Chapel. They reached Silver Creek by mid-morning, the familiar sights of her childhood home stirring complex emotions. The mining accident had forever altered her relationship with this place, transforming it from comfort to painful reminder. Yet now she returned not as a victim, but as an advocate for justice, carrying the truth that might finally honor her father's memory. Judge Morris's residence stood exactly as she remembered, a stately two-story home at the north end of town, with white columns supporting a wide veranda. Two armed deputies stood guard at the entrance, evidence of the situation's gravity. Inside, the parlor had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Maps covered tables, telegrams were stacked on every surface, and three serious-faced men in judicial robes conferred in the corner. But Emmeline saw none of this, her attention fixed immediately on the figure by the window, Thorne, standing despite his bandaged leg, his scarred face lighting with unmistakable relief as she entered. Without thought for propriety or the distinguished company present, Emmeline crossed the room directly to him. His arms opened, enfolding her in an embrace that felt like coming home. The accumulated fear, exhaustion, and tension of their journey, released in that moment of connection. "You're alive," she whispered against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong. "So are you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. When he finally released her, his mismatched eyes searched her face. The evidence? She placed the packet in his hands. "Safe, as promised." Judge Morris approached. Taller than Emmeline remembered, his beard now entirely grey, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and integrity. He extended his hands to her in warm greeting. "Miss Harper, your father would be profoundly proud to see you now." His gaze moved between her and Thorne with knowing perception. "You've both taken extraordinary risks to bring us this information. Will it be enough?" Emmeline asked, the question that had driven them through every hardship. "More than enough," Morris assured her. "We've already examined Mr. Blackwell's documents. Combined with yours and the sworn testimony of several witnesses Sheriff Ellis has gathered, we have grounds for immediate action." "Harrison Caldwell won't surrender easily," Thorne warned. "He has resources, connections." "Had," corrected one of the other judges, a stern-faced woman Emmeline didn't recognize. "The territorial governor revoked his law license this morning. By telegraph. Based on our preliminary findings, his assets are frozen pending investigation." "And Preston?" Emmeline asked, remembering the cruel dismissal at the chapel that had set everything in motion. "Fled," Sheriff Ellis reported. "But we'll find him. The border patrols are alerted." Judge Morris guided them to chairs, recognizing their exhaustion. "Rest now. You've done the impossible, brought evidence strong enough to break the Caldwell stranglehold on this territory. Justice moves slowly, but it moves inevitably toward truth when good people stand for it." As the judges returned to their deliberations, Thorne's hand found Emmeline's, his fingers intertwining with hers. In that simple touch lay acknowledgement of all they had survived together, and perhaps a promise of what might come next. "What happens now?" she asked softly, echoing their conversation from the previous night. His scarred face softened as he gazed at her. "Now we find out what life looks like after vengeance, after justice." His thumb traced gentle patterns on her palm. "If you're willing, I'd like to discover that together." In his mismatched eyes, Emmeline saw not the fearsome bounty hunter of legend, but a man who had walked through fire and emerged with his humanity intact. A man who had seen beyond her twisted foot to the strength within. A man offering not rescue, but partnership. Together, she agreed, her heart expanding with possibilities neither of them had dared imagine when they'd walked out of the Providence Hill Chapel just days earlier. "I can think of no better way to honor what we've fought." For outside, Silver Creek stirred with unusual activity as news spread of the Caldwell's impending downfall. Inside Judge Morris's study, two unlikely allies, the abandoned bride and the scarred bounty hunter, found in each other what the world had tried to deny them both: acceptance without condition, strength in vulnerability, and the promise of healing that comes not from forgetting the past, but from building something new from its lessons. In a society that often judges by appearances, Emmeline and Thorne found salvation in the most unlikely place with someone whose scars, whether visible or hidden, complemented their own. Their journey reminds us that true strength often emerges from our deepest wounds, and that healing begins when we find those who see beyond our broken places to the wholeness waiting within. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.